Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Johnny, and I am here to be the MC for this wonderful chat that we have this evening entitled Your Mother is a Chicken, the Sphere of Empathy and Harm Reduction. And we are joined by the wonderful Venerable Myōgen from Taiwan, who is joining us from Taiwan. And we're very grateful to have Venerable here with us today. So a bit of a biography of the Venerable, who uses they, them pronouns. Venerable Myōgen is a monastic trained in both the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya lineage as a bhikshu or bhikkhu in the Tendai tradition as a priest. Myōgen completed Tendai esoteric training and examined in Chiba, Japan, and became a Buddhist in their early teens through encountering the story of Shakyamuni Buddha and an early interest in questions on suffering, sickness, and death threaded by family history, personal illness, a queer identity, and an empathy for animal life. Through volunteering with diverse groups and traditions, visiting different communities and teachers, they developed a pan-Buddhist perspective, very much like what we try to do here at the Metta Center. Practicing the Lotus Sutra brought a deep faith in the one vehicle perspective and the integration of methods as taught by their teachers who emphasize direct and personal experiences. So the talk today is going to be talking a lot about vegetarian and veganism. So we do encourage a robust conversation as always, and one that's engrounded in the right speech that we always practice here at the Metta Center. So with that in mind, I'd like to pass over to you, Venerable, to start us off.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you again for inviting me, to give a talk and share some thoughts and my own practice and engage in discussion. And so, welcome to the Venerables that are joining us, all of virtuous practitioners from Australia and anywhere else in the world if they're listening. So yeah, this talk is titled Your Mother is a Chicken, and I will explain why this is personally relevant for me. But first, I would just like to begin with setting a motivation. And let's see if I can PowerPoint to work. Right. So if you would, you can read along if you like. We will do a kind of motivation setting. And then we'll do a short meditation for relaxing the body. When we're having these kinds of conversations, it's good to first just be where we are presently and see how we respond to the information, especially when we're talking about compassion or loving kindness, these kinds of more emotional or visceral feelings. So first, motivation. So to help all sentient beings across all universes, we must strive for ultimate enlightenment. The path to enlightenment begins with learning the Buddha's teachings. May all Buddhas, Dharma, Sangha, and past practitioners empower us to deepen our understanding of the teachings and equip us to overcome our own suffering and that of others. With unwavering dedication, one day we may achieve ultimate enlightenment and establish pure lands. Together, we can guide all sentient beings towards liberation from suffering and toward enlightenment. And then 3 times, homage to the root guru, Shakyamuni Buddha. Homage to the root guru, Shakyamuni Buddha. Homage to the root guru, Shakyamuni Buddha. And then you're welcome to make yourself comfortable. You can close your eyes about halfway, having a soft, unfocused gaze. And placing your hands in your lap or on your knees. And then taking a position that is both alert while at the same time relaxed and easeful. This is sometimes a kind of difficult place to find. So we can do that by first straightening out our spine, kind of having an image of being tall or elongated. And then taking a really deep breath, holding for a couple of seconds, and then exhaling, letting out any tension in the body. So setting that visual of a strong and elongated spine, inhaling, and then exhaling, letting the shoulders relax, neck relax, arms relax. And one more time, inhaling deeply, pausing, and then exhaling any tension in the body. And letting the breath be natural. No need to force it to be deep. Just noticing the quality of our breath, whether it's a long or short breath, cool or warm, whether we feel it in our belly or our chest, our back. Just noticing the experience of the breath right now. And then bringing the attention to the body, guiding that breath to where we might feel some tension. Where we bring our intention. So if you are feeling stress or tightness in the shoulders, bringing the attention there, imagining the breath going there, relaxing the muscles. Maybe there's tension in the lower back. So again, guiding the breath there. Imagining a kind of flow or ease, a softness. And bringing our attention back to the quality of the breath. Again, just noticing whether it is shallow or deep, a short or long breath. It's cool or warm. If our inhales and exhales are smooth or rough. Just noticing if it's changed from the beginning. Even a few minutes of attention to our breath, to our body, to where we have tension or comfort, can shift a lot of how we're feeling in that moment. So we can use this when we're having discussions, particularly emotional ones. I don't, expect talking about vegetarianism or veganism to be emotional, but quite often they are. Depending on what our relationship, with people we've met in the past that may have been vegetarian or vegan, our own relationship to food, experiences we may have had with family as well. Particularly when we're talking about developing loving kindness or compassion. One of the images we often use is the mother or the family member. But this isn't always accessible to everyone. They may not have had positive relationships, right? So we have to be able to see not just the mental aspect, our story, our history, but where it feels in our body to what the physical response is. This is part of us being this kind of complex physical, mental, emotional beings, right? And I'm going to have some questions you don't need to answer now, but you might hold them in mind throughout the talk. And if you do want to share at some point, your thoughts on it, I'm happy to hear. And you can type those in the chat anytime you have a reflection or a question or need a clarification. And I'll trust I'll be alerted so that I can respond either closer to the topic or later on in the later part of the talk. So my first question is, if all beings have once been our mothers, right? So this is from the perspective of rebirth. If we've had limitless, countless rebirths, we've been in infinite types of relationships with beings, we can come to the conclusion that all beings have been our mothers at one point. So if we actually, believe this, what would that, how would we use this understanding? How would we then justify killing, right, another being for any purpose, right? We have to have a pretty convincing justification. Just like now, if someone said, oh, kill your mother, you would probably need a very good reason in order to do this. So how do we reconcile this with this particular teaching or doctrine within Buddhism? Also, personally, does our commitment to all beings, when we talk about, particularly in the explicit teachings of Mahayana, right, that all sentient beings, we vow to liberate all of them. We wish for all of them to become Buddhas, right? Does this encompass non-human life in practice? Right? It's a very lofty ideal. Limitless, countless beings. I want to liberate all of them. How does that then translate into our ordinary experience? And do we include non-human life? And I mean that not just animals, but this can also be plants and the environment. These factors support life, right? So they're very deeply bound with our own life. We can look at that from an ecological perspective, right? Our impact on the environment will impact our own health and well-being too. Likewise, what we do to the environment will affect other beings. And then another, general question to ask yourself, I have a typo, but is it necessary to have a religious or doctrinal position, right, to unravel suffering and develop compassion? For maybe those of us that are Buddhist or have made that commitment or identity, we're here learning about Buddhism, right? We might want to hear what the Buddhist position is. But I also want to ask, is it necessary to have a religious or doctrinal position, right, just to address suffering and develop compassion as ordinary qualities, right? We could even bring this up in terms of just ethics in general, why we might have more secular or humanistic or psychological approaches to ethics, where people feel that, religion was a way perhaps of explaining ethics and having social control through, beliefs, right? So we can also ask this to, to be vegetarian or vegan, right? To practice compassion towards animals. Do we need a religious justification in order to make an actual change? So I have here veg with a little squiggle, so to encompass all the variations of vegetarian or veganism, whether that's people that omit egg or milk or certain kinds of meat, right? Any kind of decision towards being more plant-based and less animal-based. So our motivation or our reason. There's a few that we can identify, and this is not all of it, but broadly covering. One that you'll come across frequently is oneself, especially when people are promoting vegetarianism. In terms of, if you become vegetarian, you will live a longer life and have less, chances of cancer or heart disease, or maybe you'll have some kind of beauty benefit, right? These are kinds of ways to sell or have a vegetarian diet be appealing. It's often the self-interest, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. We should definitely want, feel healthy, be healthy. And this could be a starting point for some people. It could also be their only motivation. They might have a combination at different times as well, particularly if they start having more education or exposure or experience in vegetarian communities, or learning about vegetarian cooking or environmental or animal practices. And so that would lead us into the second one, which is others. Sometimes people's motivation is the animals. They have a lot of empathy for animals, and so that's their starting point, right? The suffering of the animals and their well-being. And then the third one might be environmental concerns. Some people may be more neutral about their own health, be more neutral about animals in particular, but they are worried about the kind of global situation. And that could be just for humans even, right? They want to be living in a nice environment, and they want the people around them to also be able to enjoy that. And, seeing the impact of industrial or factory farming, agriculture. So it might be packaged into this larger concern about the environment. And then there's one that might be more inclusive, right? So they might see ethical reasons, right? Philosophical reasons that might include self, others, or environment, or combination. They might see an intersection between being vegetarian or vegan, being veg, with things like capitalism, right? Or economy. They might see connections to gender, misogyny. There's a lot of other ways veg practice or the philosophy of it might incorporate many other causes and motivations. And so, there also might be religious, cultural, social, economical reasons that people are veg. So we can't really paint, vegetarian or vegan people or practice in one particular way. We have to kind of look a little bit more on the individual end. So then right intention is the next part of this. So how do we enact this practice? We might have a particular motive, this reason, but then how do we do it, right? This is an important question to ask, particularly as Buddhists, as we may often put intent over impact. And nowadays, in a lot of social justice movements, you see impact being more valued than intent, right? So as Buddhist practitioners, we're kind of having to navigate that in a new way, being able to address it. In my earlier education, it was always intent over impact. Actually, if the impact was bad, but the intent was right, then, for us personally, karmically, this was fine, right? But, now it's a lot more nuanced, and we do have to address impact as well and be accountable for it, rather than using intent just to, wipe away or, remove any accountability. So then is our relationship with practice of a veg practice, or our diet and consumption, is this increasing greed and hate, or is it reducing it, right? Is this helping us have more renunciation, more loving kindness, more compassion, not just for animals, but for other beings as well? Or are we finding that we're actually getting into more arguments, right? Or we are becoming greedy for some sort of social or spiritual or religious type of reward, right? This is something other people can't answer for us, of course. We just have to do our own investigation. But this intention is something that can go up and down or go in different directions in the course of either cultivating or having a veg lifestyle or practice. And of course, I want to address how vegetarianism has been in texts, right, and sutras. And you'll find different folks will maybe, depending whether they accept different texts or not, what their tradition is, and the localization of their practice. So again, take this more as general, and then you might have more specific or nuanced interpretations based on your own community or teachers. So with text, we like to look at text in context, right? So it's called intertextuality, right? So who are the writers? At what time were they writing? What was the culture around the writing, right? It might be very convenient to look at text and be like, oh, well, there's this rule, or they said this, or this truth, right? Seems like it's like unilateral, like across all time and all places. Very rarely is that the case. It's my own position that for Buddhism, the Buddha was not presenting a theory of everything, right? It was very much directed towards addressing suffering, this existential issue that we're having. So looking in the context of the Buddha's time, there was this kind of Vedic Brahmanic culture. Many of people in this segment were vegetarian. There is also a religious environment of engaging in different ascetic practices. There are also other religious groups that may have been vegetarian in different ways. Particularly, we might point out the Jain movement, where for some, they only eat above ground vegetables, right? Because digging up vegetables also damages creatures, right? There may be even unseen creatures that we harm. So they took the concept of non-harming even further. Also, they were living in an agricultural society, right? So most people were growing their own food. At that time, you could say having meat or having an animal may have been more of a social type of event, right? People were not able to just easily just buy animal or buy meat every day. And there's no refrigerators or freezers, right? So, if you do have an animal killed, you have to kind of consume it and share it rather quickly. There was also the wandering renunciates. So practitioners were living mostly on alms. There was a culture of this, whether you were from one group or another. Donors may be giving to whomever, right? That comes through, and learning different kinds of teachings and supporting different kinds of practitioners. So also at that time, there were not really, in the same way that we have now, established temples or monasteries where people may have been spending their whole lives in one building or area. They were much more transient. They might have come together occasionally, right? Maybe a couple times a month or for periods in the year to discuss the Dharma, share, support one another in practice, reflect. And then between that, they may have been wandering around from village to village or located in a particular forest or area. The monastics or renunciates at that time were more alms dependent. Again, the culture was very supportive and receptive to that. And they had these small co-supporting groups that may have been different in how they, how intensely maybe they practiced different ascetic practices or different teachings, what they focused on. We see that with the great practitioners of the Buddha, different practitioners being kind of foremost in different practices or meditations or having different qualities. So then that brings up, what kind of meat can these wandering monastics eat, right? And I bring this up because these three factors are often used to explain why one doesn't need to be vegetarian, or why vegetarian practice is somehow excluded from the Buddha's teachings for anybody, for monastics or lay people. So we can talk about this a little bit. So these three factors of purity were given to monastics, so people living nearly exclusively on generosity and alms rounds, right? So they're going from house to house and then receiving the food that was being cooked at that time from that home. And sometimes they may have been invited to feasts and events. At the time of this one, these three factors for purity, the Buddha was invited to a home, and there were piles of meat. And according to one version of this, James said, how can this, so-called sage or enlightened being be eating all of this meat? Right? This is all offered to him. Isn't that harmful? He says he practices harmlessness, compassion, but that doesn't seem to be the case, right? So these three were established, said, as long as the meat has not been seen, you did not see it killed, right? You did not hear it die or the cries of the animal, and you do not suspect that it was killed for you. Then a monastic is able to receive this. So it's kind of like incidental kind of meat, right? You pass by a home, they happen to be cooking something, and then they offered. And, monastics could request meat if they were sick, right? So there were exceptions, right? So these rules for the monastics are not absolute. There's often exceptions and certain circumstances for each of them. They're very practical kinds of guidelines or precepts, right? So just to be clear, he wasn't saying you can't be vegetarian. You can eat meat, but it does have to fit into these three areas. And this also another point that's brought up is that Shakyamuni Buddha is said to have rejected Devadatta, his cousin's proposals for the Sangha. One of those was being the monastics become strict vegetarians. So don't even use this threefold rule. You must just reject meat and be vegetarian. He also suggested some others, like living only in the forest and only by begging, wearing only robes made of rags, or living in the open air. And the rejection of this, some say, is because the Buddha rejected being vegetarian and meat is fine, right? Another way you could see this is he rejected these proposals from Devadatta because Devadatta's intent and motives were not correct. These were not necessarily about removing attachments and aversion or practicing compassion, but at that time it was more like one-upping, right? Shakyamuni's Sangha being like, well, we're more strict, we're more aesthetic, so we're more spiritual somehow. So we're going to make this mandatory for everyone. While in Shakyamuni's teachings, there are many of these, I have them here, these optional practices that monastics can undertake, right? So some of them are quite similar, and they might be temporary or long-term, but they're not mandatory. So if you don't have the disposition or ability, then no problem, right? These are ways to intensify one's practice. The other factor that we see is, for lay precepts as well, lay practitioners, non-monastics, abstaining from wrong livelihood is mentioned a number of times, right? And so he says here, monks, a lay follower, should not engage in 5 types of businesses. Which 5? So this is business and weapons, human beings, meat, intoxicants, and poison. And these are the 5 types of business that a lay follower should not engage in. Basically, if one is involved in these careers, one could move towards out of that profession. So what's the common factor here in these professions? And do we have any similar careers or activities today that we, might put in a kind of category together? I think we're seeing the common factor here being that all of these cause pain or harm in some way. Even if you just make and sell weapons and you're not using it yourself, you're enabling others, right? You're providing the instruments. Of course, if you're selling human beings, That's takes away the freedom and happiness of others. Business and meat will require the raising and killing of animals. Intoxicants, while again, intoxicants are more neutral, but more often than not, they lead to people being heedless and engaging in other kinds of harmful and negative actions. So they don't contribute to wisdom. And poison, of course, can be used to kill or harm, right? Whether that's like, you're poisoning the ground, or you're trying to be an assassin back in the day, and so you're here concocting and selling these types of instruments, right? So back to this three purities for meat, seen, heard, or suspected. One question that comes up then is, okay, well, let's say I'm not a monastic, or I am a monastic, but I don't go on alms round. I live at a temple and people come, and they donate food, right? So how far does responsibility go? Does this apply to a consumer, right? If any of us go into a store and purchase meat, are we how do you say, was this meat killed, or do we suspect this meat was killed for us, right? And there's a kind of tension between this, whether or not the general consumer is considered us individually or not, right? And then participating in things like supply and demand, or factory farming, or purchasing and bringing food to Dharma places or for offerings. All these are kind of newer factors that may not have been in the three purities for meat. Factory farming and big grocery stores weren't really a thing 2,500 years ago. So how do we apply these concepts now? And then moving on from those three purities, in the later Mahayana texts, we see these 6 vegetarian fasting days. So these are days when people may take the 8 precepts. And they're following a lunar calendar, so this includes a new and full moon. So 8th, 14th, 15th, 23rd, and then 2 days at the end of the month. Something for you to consider too, if you've practiced the 8 precepts before, whether as a vegetarian approach, as you would in a Mahayana tradition, or not, right? What is the overall effect of doing this at intervals throughout the month, right? How do these start changing our habits? How do we relate to our senses, practice sense restraint? And then going further into the kind of Mahayana timeline, we have very explicit vegetarian precepts or ideas. These are found in texts like the Brahmanet Sutra, Lankavatara Sutra, Shurangama, Mahaparinirvana. If you're familiar with them, if not, you can find translations of them. Especially if you start looking up Buddhism and vegetarianism, these ones will come up a lot for Mahayana practitioners. And they're quite direct about vegetarian practice. I'll share some of them. In the Lankavatara in particular, there are 8 points. There's a whole chapter called on meat eating. And of these 8 points, it's pointed out that the present day animals that we are around may have been one's relatives in the past, right? Also, one's current parents or relatives, family, loved ones, partners, children, right? In a future life, they may be born as an animal. And there's no logic in exempting the meat of some animals on customary grounds while not exempting all meat. This is a claim that's made. And then meat is always considered impure. It's contaminated by body waste, right? So we can even think of this in terms of like sausage, right? These are the intestines that are cleaned out, right? So we even try to clean meat, right? And if we look at earlier texts talking about the impurity of the body, right? We're taught to kind of contemplate all these different fluids and pus and components that we have in the body. The next point is the prospect of being killed. This spreads terror among animals. When animals see other animals being killed, they tend to panic, or if they smell blood. And then all meat is nothing other than carrion, meaning it is a corpse, right? That you would see like in a field or like roadkill. Meat eating makes a consumer to become cruel and sensual, So one might crave more meat and then make different reasons for why different meats are better or not better. Or we end up with things like veal, for example, different ways of raising animals to cause their flesh to taste in different ways. And then the last point is man is not a carnivore by nature. The next text is the Brahmanet Bodhisattva precepts. So these are sets of precepts that Mahayana monastics will take. There's 10 major ones and 48 minor ones. In the major ones, it said that a disciple of the Buddha shall not intentionally kill any living being, nor encourage others to kill. This is also similar to the monastic precepts that bhikshus and bhikshunis would take. And so here, though, it says, instead, if one sees others killing, one must protect and rescue the victim. So there's a proactive element. And the secondary precept is not to eat meat because it destroys great compassion. If you deliberately eat meat, you are defiling the self-nature of all Buddhas. And there are some reasons for this, which we can talk about later if that's interesting. But that might have been, a kind of wall of text, I understand. I'm not a fan of just like quoting lots of sutras, but it's good to just see this kind of shift that happens from meat being very kind of permissible under certain circumstances to being very explicitly not, right? As times have changed. So yeah, our conditions change, and now we're living, over 2,500 years later in a different culture. So what are some of these conditions that are shifting for us? And how do we respond to them? So now we have permanent residences for monastics, and they may come into very considerable amounts of wealth, resources, power, or even social influence. They may have platforms where their voice is amplified and they're able to teach, right? We see this in Taiwan in particular. Buddhist monastics just did so much in terms of educating on being vegetarian and the merits of being vegetarian, both personally and spiritually, that Taiwan in many ways is like a vegetarian paradise, maybe one of the best countries to be vegetarian. And also there has been a patron recipient shift. So in terms of alms rounds, right, monastics were wandering to different houses or communities in order to receive offerings. And now we have people coming regularly to Dharma centers or temples to volunteer or to prepare food or to bring food specifically for the monastics and lay community that are there. So this is a very different shift, right, than the very early period. We also have changes in our social values, education levels, relationships to each other, both locally but in a global sense. We're dealing with multicultural environments, shifts in how economy is working, all the industrial changes like factory farming, and kind of this massive agricultural, like automatic type of agriculture, the large machinery, like large scale, right? And global imports and exports. So food supply and our practices and impact on the environment have all changed from a very kind of small local way that was existing in the Buddha's time to now. If there's any comments or questions up to this point, I'm happy to respond.
There's none in the
Okay.
chat at the moment, Venerable,
Great.
so I'm happy for you to
Great.
keep going.
Great. So I mentioned in the title harm reduction, and this is a model that I really have an affinity towards. I learned a harm reduction model in San Francisco when I was much younger. Many of my earlier like teenage friends hung out with a lot of gutter punks who some of which became addicts. And then being in San Francisco later in my 20s, there was a lot of recreational drug culture, which can go all kinds of directions and have all kinds of impacts on people's lives. And so harm reduction is a response to drug use, quite often in drug programs, drug abuse programs. The goal is to get people off drugs. Our goal in these programs is drug users must stop using drugs and become part of society in a particular way. Harm reduction model said that's actually quite ineffective. If a person does not from their own side wish to see this type of change, right? It's actually very difficult. They will just go right back. So they need a different set of strategies. So I'm going to read from the harm reduction site. So harm reduction incorporates a spectrum of strategies that include safer use, managed use, abstinence, meeting people who use drugs where they're at, and addressing the conditions of use along with the use itself, right? Because harm reduction demands that interventions and policies designed to serve people who use drugs reflect individual and community needs, there is no universal definition or formula for implementing harm reduction. So this is quite a unique, I think, approach that for me aligns a lot with Buddhism, right? And I will give you my rewritten version of the harm reduction model for Buddhists, is I do see our practice essentially as a harm reduction until we're a Buddha, until we're perfect in wisdom, merit, and skill. More than likely, we will be causing harm to ourselves and others. So Buddhism incorporates a spectrum of strategies that include ethics, practices, abstinence, meeting people who have afflictions where they're at, and that includes ourselves, and addressing the external conditions, as well as the behavior and disposition of the individual, so the internal conditions. Because Buddhism uses skillful means designed to serve people who suffer, they reflect specific individual and community needs, these skillful methods, right? So there's no universal formula for implementing transformation. Like any medical intervention, it needs to be applied appropriately. So we can use this same approach for vegetarian and vegan practice. Again, looking at our, our motivation, our reason, right? We want to reduce suffering. And so of all of the tools that are offered for that, vegetarian and vegan practice is one of those, right? And for some, that might be more upfront and immediate in their life. And for others, it might be further down the list of priorities as they're dealing with other types of needs or characteristics they have, right, that need to be addressed through other forms of Buddhist practice. So we can see vegetarian and vegan practice as a one set of tools. So I suggest this progression of expedient methods or expedient means. And this is not to say that one must follow this. We might come in at different places, of course. But here's one kind. The first is that we go for refuge by admiring the qualities of the triple gem and having an understanding of suffering, of cyclic existence. Right? So we start looking at maybe rebirth or our death or what will happen next. And then we seek an inspiring and protective teaching or practice or people, right, through the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And then the next is we would eliminate the most gross causes of suffering, right, and lower rebirths. And so we request receiving the 5 precepts. We follow a set of ethics that are not the end of ethics, but they deal with the heaviest kinds of impact in our life, kind of a foundation or baseline. Right? And sometimes people read 5 precepts, like, oh, it's easy, I don't kill, I don't steal, no problem. But we can get more subtle and nuanced with this as well as lay practitioners over time. And then we would also deepen our understanding of karma or cause and effect. And then next, giving up wrong livelihood. So we might transition from one type of job to another that is more in line with our goals or our values. And we wish to reduce the situational or external causes that might pressure us to create certain kinds of negative karma. And then as practitioners, we might start implementing this 3 pure meats, right, to reduce our greed for flesh or meat. And then further, the 6 fasting days to become more familiar with the vegetarian practice and sensory restraint. And then maybe we practice meditations on equanimity and loving kindness so that we can kind of shape and transform our minds to have more wholesome and positive states throughout the day and, over time, make that more natural and habitual. And then we may also take up various disciplines, right? Specific kinds of practices, vegetarian practice being one of them, as a sort of extension of our compassion and equality towards others. So why is my mother a chicken? Why is your mother a chicken? So earlier I brought up, considering that we may have countless lives, and at some point, every single being has been our mother, as well as our current life, the people we know, right? We may end up in a situation where others are animals, right? For myself, I grew up with a single mother, and I had an older brother who was 10 years older than me. And we both had different fathers. So we kind of different generation, different experience. And there's a lot that I have about death and impermanence with my family, but my brother in particular, who I love, but he and I are very opposite kinds of people in a lot of ways. As a kid, the joke would be that we could share a hamburger because we could each have one piece of bread. He would not eat the vegetables, and I would not eat the meat, right? And so, it was a perfect split, right? All the things he was good at, I was bad at, and vice versa, right? For him, the world was very black and white in terms of ethics and morals, and for myself, it was very gray. And I was much more emotionally expressive than he was. Um, so my brother did like to terrorize me as a child. And one of those things was like we were eating seafood, like a red lobster or something like this, some kind of restaurant. And he ordered a whole lobster. And there's this thing you can do with the claw of the lobster. Maybe those of you that eat lobster, but you can pull a tendon and kind of make the claw snap, snap, snap. Um, so he orders a lobster, and when they put it down, the lobster was facing me, and I started having kind of panic. I said, "This lobster is looking at me, right? This lobster is just like staring me in the eyes, and it's dead." And this stressed me out. And then he took the lobster arm and started doing the clicking, and he's like, "Oh, the lobster like came alive, it's alive." And this was such a visceral, I mean, I remember it clearly still. It was such a visceral experience for me, like how horrific, right? You just have this dead lobster that has some sort of sense of being. It has eyes like I do, and it's staring directly at me. Um, so he really got like a kick out of this and kept doing it, and I was like in tears about the whole thing. Um, Around that same time, so I was 6 years old, at elementary school, I think first grade. We were talking about Easter. And this was like the 6-year-old version of reproduction cycle, right? Like how babies are made. And so we're talking about Easter and eggs and chickens. And they just very clearly explained, like, there's all animals have a mother. And so there's, we're going to paint eggs, right? And so the egg, right, eventually will become a baby chicken, and the egg has a mama chicken. This also very much stressed me out. I went back home and I told my mother, I said, I just found out that, chickens have children, and, eggs are baby chickens, and chicken nuggets are moms. And so I told my mother, I was like, I can't eat eggs or chicken anymore. And she asked why, and I explained. And I said, well, if a giant chicken ate you, I would be very upset. I would be very sad. This would not feel good, right? And if I was eaten by a giant chicken, um, you would feel sad, right? This would tear our family apart. And I had a dream at that time too, because it was such an imprint for me of my mother being eaten by a chicken. And so from then I stopped. Thankfully, my mother was very understanding. She couldn't argue with me on this. She didn't really have a counter for me as a 6-year-old. So she would cook and then set food aside for me first before adding meat to it for my brother. She herself didn't really like or eat a lot of meat to begin with. She would at times, but wasn't like decidedly vegetarian or anything. And so that's been my motivation, and it continues to be my motivation. And so this was at 6 years old, I began. And then later in my teens, hanging out with like crusty punks, I came across factory farming books from like PETA or something. So these kinds of photos. I learned about factory farming, and I said, oh, well, I care about the chickens and the eggs, and they're not exempt still. Just not eating them isn't enough, right? Many are killed in the process of egg factories, and they don't have long lives, and they have very terrible conditions. So I felt complicit in that. I became vegan. At the time, my mother also became vegan, and so I was about 16 or 17 then. And I've continued most of my life being vegan. Sometimes I do have dairy if it's offered, in small amounts I can handle, but I kind of now get like a lactose intolerance, and it's still my preference to be vegan as much as possible. But as a monastic, I'm not always in control of my diet, and sometimes people go very much out of their way, despite trying to give a warning ahead of time, or avoid certain kinds of situations where I might, make people feel socially uncomfortable. I try to be very conscious of this. So yeah, that's where it is now. And so, my mother will be a chicken one day. I was a chicken once. And it's my belief that have all been chicken mothers to myself, and I have been your chicken mother as well. And so on that basis, we can start talking about expanding our sense of empathy or compassion. Yeah. If there's any comment now, great. Otherwise, I will continue. So expanding the sphere of empathy, this is the second part. Some of you may be familiar with the different ways that this is done, and different traditions have different ways of doing this. I think as children, many children have this pretty quickly. They kind of do get quite stressed at seeing animals being harmed most of the time. And it's not until they are kind of taught that it's normal, right, to eat animals, and that that's what animals are for, right? Or maybe that's why God put them here, right? Or that they're very delicious, and the taste is more important than maybe the relationship to the animal, or that animal intelligence is lower, right? So they don't need the same kind of consideration for their feelings, or maybe they don't even have feelings at all. You find all kinds of ways, and you may identify them in yourself as well. If you think back to, maybe what your family or friends said about meat as you were growing up, particularly for folks growing up on farms. My grandparents had farms as well. And I've also heard of stories of, people that kind of got traumatized in the process and either became veg, or they didn't get traumatized by seeing, a farm killing, but they have other rationale for it, where they may prioritize human life in a different way due to religious or cultural beliefs. So one that you might all be familiar with are the four limitless hearts, or four immeasurables, Brahma Viharas. So divine abodes, so loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. And we can develop these for capacities or wholesome states of mind. And they may have a very direct and literal kind of impact on our behavior, right? But first, we do need to habituate ourselves to these ways of thinking and feeling, right, towards other beings and ourselves. This meditation is often broken into four groups. So usually starting with a close friend or family, someone that's neutral, someone that we dislike a little bit, right? Not our worst enemy or like final boss. And then universally extending this to all beings, all creatures. These feelings of friendliness or good regard, kind regard. You can find a lot of recorded meditations on this as well. So the great thing is you can easily access these types of meditations to, start infusing your mind with these qualities and feelings. And then in the other traditions, we end up with called 7-point meditation, or equalizing self and others. I'm not going to read them out, but you can kind of compare and also find similar recordings or scripts that you can follow that can be very short or very long. And these can also help generate good internal feelings. And these are more step by step, a little bit more steps than we might have in the Brahma Viharas. And then there's also a combined method, which combines those two, which is also very detailed and structured. These are coming from the Tibetan traditions, which, if you like lists, these are great approaches. They're very systematic ways of expanding your sense of empathy or care. So I'm going to give a contemplation. It's not really one of these, more traditional methods. It'll be more visual. And I would just like you to check in for yourself, how you're how you respond, what your first thought is, or your feeling, or how your body might react, right? And as I mentioned, there are some photos, they're not super graphic or anything. There's not going to be any bloody animals or anything like this. There's no factories, but it's a lot related to birth. And kind of people's facial expressions and things. So if that will bother you, you can kind of turn off the video for now. So the first one starts with birth. When we think about all beings as our mother, we can usually start with our own mother. Or if you're a mother yourself, you are familiar, or if you're a father or parent, and you have a child, you may have seen this process. You may have seen or experienced going through 9 months of pregnancy and all the difficulties that come with that, all the help you need and support you need, education, right? This is not easy socially, emotionally, or physically. So this is the first burden that a mother goes through. And then the second one would be the actual birth process itself is quite painful. I don't think I've heard of or met a mother that said, yeah, I really enjoyed giving birth. It was wonderful. Some have said, it wasn't so bad, or they had a lot of drugs to help with the pain. And even then, it still wasn't enough. And then the after care required, right, is significant, and the toll on the body is huge, right? So this is a great kindness that our mothers share with us selflessly. No matter how terrible you think your mother was, or what your relationship is, they still did this, and you're here. So we can at least thank them for that, right? Have a positive regard in that sense. The second part then is, raising us, right? We are incapable of protecting ourselves, feeding ourselves, cleaning ourselves, navigating the world. And so parents and family or caregivers are the ones that basically protect us from the harm of the world. They even try to shield us emotionally and socially from things that might give us a kind of bad feeling even, or just a negative view of the world. And often they try to secure the best opportunities for us in terms of education or food, right? Or entertainment or toys or enrichment. And then all the other things they put up with, like us puking and pooping all over ourselves, breastfeeding, bathing us. Then we do things like spill food and spaghetti all over ourselves, or we get into dangerous situations with sharp objects in the home, right? And they have to look out for all these kinds of environmental issues. So that might be easy to relate to, if we've been a mother or parent, or been around, or know it closely. And then, the next one might be, what's the kind of closest animals that we might see if you've had pets that you love and care for, and you see that they have individual personalities, right? You may have seen them also give birth and be pregnant and take care of their children. This is quite heartwarming. I've always loved pictures of baby animals with parent animals. They're very adorable. And it's easy because it's cute and they're close to us, and we are, comforted by pets. So let's extend it further. Let's look at wild animals. And I included one for folks in Australia that you might have a soft spot for, maybe. But yeah, wild animals also, we can find many, many photos of wild animal parents showing care and regard for their young, protecting them and teaching them how to survive in the world. And then next, we go into the animals that we often use as products, right? So chickens, eggs, pigs, cows. They also have these relationships naturally. They're very caring for their young. And they also experience stress when their young are in danger. And again, there's exceptions. Some, just like some parents are not particularly parental. Some animals, living beings, don't have that a strong drive either. They might kind of just kick their young out, and if you survive, you survive. We have all types. But for the purposes of developing wholesome states of mind, we want to look at the kind of best examples. And then this one might be a little bit more difficult. Here I have scorpion with young scorpions on its back. You may not know this, but they do carry their babies on their backs and kind of drag them around. And they're born pure white, right? Their shells have not hardened, so they're very squishy. And so the mother scorpion, once the nest hatches, will take them around and kind of feed them this way. Even snakes, after they have eggs, they guard and defend their young. And then we also have a mouse or a rat, which I think, again, very cute. But some people get freaked out because they're very strongly associated with disease, right? And kind of invading the home. They're an inconvenience to our quality of life sometimes. So there's definitely relationships of care that happen across different animals, species. And it's good for us to recognize, can we look at these as individual beings, right, with their own complex relationships to their environment or to the other beings in their environment? Or do we just kind of broadly go, cow, right? All cow share one collective cow mind, right? All pigs have the same personality. But our cats and dogs, my dog or my cat has its own unique name, right, and identity, and certain foods it likes and certain games it likes. But am I able to see this in other animals, right? Because we do find that to be the case, like with farm animals, for example, you'll find some are a little bit more angry, some are a little bit more calm, right? Some are more playful. So using that, how might we be consumers in the world with a broader mind and a bigger heart, right? So how can we include more beings and more situations in the way that we interact with the world? I bring up this picture. This is from Japan in some church somewhere. These are called water baby statues in Japan. And this is a kind of babyfied version of Ksitigarbha or Earth Store Bodhisattva. And these are often made for children that die young or miscarriages or abortions. And so Ksitigarbha is often shown with babies kind of hanging off of him. He has a very solemn kind of, he looks like a monk. Sometimes a slight smile, but quite serious. And then some also from a probably Catholic or Christian graveyard, some statues of children with toys. And these Japanese statues have these red bibs, which are also offerings to the children. I'm asking this, how do we connect it to consumption, right? So all of our consumption always will affect other beings, perhaps positively, perhaps negatively. So even in the case of consuming food, whether it's vegetarian food or non-vegetarian food, we're still impacting the environment directly or indirectly, and there's still some sort of loss of life, right? It's impossible to have a totally harmless existence. This is part of the issue with samsara, right? It's not a utopia, and so we will suffer. And I bring these statues in here to kind of show this connection between the hopes, parents, sentient beings have for one another, for their young, and also this connection to loss and sadness that we will collectively experience, whether now or later on. Sometimes you find places with thousands or hundreds of these special halls and temples as well, where people regularly come to collectively mourn the loss of life that was unlived. For eating, some of you may know for at least Mahayana temples. I've not spent time in Theravada temples to know if they recite these, but these are the 5 mealtime contemplations, one translation. So these are actually very profound, and they can be a whole practice. Right? So we turn our mealtime into a meditation. So I contemplate that all the causes and conditions and the kindness and efforts of others by which I have received this food. So this includes their labor, right? And the kind of suffering they go through, whether it's an animal or a farmer or the person selling, right, fruits and vegetables. They're giving up their time and their life in order to do this job, right, in order to provide these things. And we benefit from it at the time of eating. So we don't just receive this food like, I bought it, it's mine, I deserve it, right? It was given to me, I own it. It's actually on the backs and blood of many people, right? People and creatures. So we should, have much gratitude and seriously receive our food at that time. And we can also contemplate interdependent origination, that many causes and conditions have to occur just to receive one grain of rice or one piece of carrot, right? So not to be wasteful. And then we contemplate ourselves, right, our own practice and virtue, whether we are diligent or deficient and are actually worthy of this offering that was given out of the kindness of others. And then our own mental states, guarding it from wrongdoing, such as greed, and the other defilements, such as hatred or anger, right? Have we actively been working on transforming these mental states? And then also seeing this food as medicine, right? So we're not just indulging for the sake of indulging, but we're using this food to nourish our bodies and sustain our lives. So we're taking what we need, what is healthy, right? And in the right quantity, not just out of flavor, right? Of course, I wish we all have delicious food, but that is not the main concern, right? Uh, and then finally, contemplating the aim of Buddhahood. So we receive this food in order to practice, become Buddhas. I have here, I'm not, again, not going to read them all, but you can maybe quickly scan, or I can provide the slides. These are different sutras from the Agamas, talking about killing, right? Non-killing or violence or suffering, and this being applied to all beings. And then I follow that with the Lankavatara, Brahmanet, Nirvana, and Shurangama, these very explicit sutras about not eating meat. And some may say vegetarian practice is extreme asceticism. There's a quote, have it listed up there. Basically, the Buddha's stance that we have recorded is that when asceticism is pursued and unskillful qualities grow and skillful qualities wane, then this type of thing is something that should not be pursued. But if ascetic practices reduce unskillful qualities, right, and our virtues grow, then this is something that we can choose to engage in. And so I believe in the case of vegetarian practice, it can be skillful and it could also be done in an unskillful way. And this is why I bring in this harm reduction approach, right? We should be discerning and wise about how we talk about or practice different practices, whether it's being vegetarian or other types of ascetic practices, or even in a schedule, how we push ourselves in different ways. So I'm going to stop there because I can keep going with slides. And I want to make sure there's enough time for any questions or comments or something you would like me to particularly address.
Thank you so much, Venerable. That was
Yeah,
absolutely amazing. It was a really great and insightful
thank-
presentation. There's been quite a few questions that have been sent through in the chat. I really enjoyed the discussion that you sort of provided the whole time around that the emphasis is on harm reduction. It's not
mhm,
necessarily on this absolute binary either or. It's on our
right.
intention to reduce harm slowly. And I really enjoyed the statement you had towards the end about how it's impossible for us to actually have this harmless existence. And I think it tied in really well with one of the questions that was asked in the chat,
Mm,
which was, do you kill a mosquito? So where
personally.
do we draw the line, I suppose, on,
Right, right.
because a mosquito is like intentional, even if it might be automatic,
Yeah,
versus we might accidentally step on a bug, but it is
yeah,
an intentional act for the
right,
mosquito. How do we navigate that in
right.
this perspective?
Definitely. That's brought up. I know I love bringing up, we always use the most extreme examples for stuff when we talk about ethics, right? Like kind of imagination. But, mosquitoes are one. Having bugs in your house is another. For me personally, I uh, train myself not to kill mosquitoes, I will be bitten and let it bite me. I don't have the reflex anymore. In one of my own trainings, one of the senior monastics said, for monastics, for lay people, the precept of not killing is like not killing a human being, right? And then anything other than that is kind of a secondary, right, thing. But during my training, one of the seniors said, if a monastic is killing mosquitoes out of reflex, it means they haven't really practiced the novice precepts very well. He's not saying to go ahead and start judging monastics if they do this. It's not what I'm advocating. But yeah, we should quite very seriously, I think his point was very seriously take this. Whether or not you kill a mosquito is going to be on your own decision, right? You may be in a place where there are mosquitoes with deadly diseases. And in that case, you might make a different decision. You may accept that, right? Possible consequences that come from it. Yeah, I'm not going to give you like a cut and clear answer. For myself, I don't. And that's what I can speak to because that's all I can do and have control over. Yeah.
So,
Is that right?
yeah, so Venerable, does that same principle, I suppose, could that be applied then to beings, so insects and other bugs that might be accidentally killed in the production of
Right.
vegetarian food?
Right. So this is brought up, as you mentioned, intent, right? There's a big difference in intent between raising a cow specifically for the purposes of selling its meat, right? Killing and selling it. That's a much different than farming, where the intention is to grow a particular crop and then sell that crop. But of course, machinery and different chemicals that may be used will impact the environment. So again, it's back to that point about harmlessness, right? It's impossible to have a totally harmless diet. I'd say most veg people understand that, right? That we don't call ourselves harmless, but it's more that we're, as far as one is capable and able to reduce direct and intentional killing that we can control, we can do so, right? Yeah.
Great,
And
thank
if
you.
we think too about like, you can find these kinds of numbers and things,
Mm,
to how do you say, raise a cow for meat, we still have to do farming, right?
mm.
And the cow's going to eat a lot more vegetable crop, right? So all that crop, all those resources are going to a cow. So like pound for pound, there's a big difference. And in this case, we're just multiplying the amount of killing in that sense. Uh,
Great, thank you. We'll now go to a question that one of the participants wants to unmute for. So Simran, it is over to you.
Please, thank you.
We can't hear you, oh, we can see you, Simran, but we can't hear you.
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Yes. Hello, Venerable. Thank you for the talk. The comment that I wanted to make is I just wanted to share with about my experiences. So, I and you mentioned that there was very different reasons why people follow whatever diets or maybe
Yeah.
vegetarian. So, most of my life I was growing up just eating meat but not beef in a Hindu household,
Mm,
and then later in high school went to vegetarian. After 2 years, vegan, and then slow like well vegan and from there fruitarian, and I was
mm,
fruitarian for 2 years, refusing to even have an apple juice because that's not
mm.
how the apple came from the tree.
Yeah.
And 2.5 years of this meant being not really going to restaurants with friends or eating with families or always having to pack my own meals. And upon deepening my practice into Buddhism and moving away from attachment to this world, this life, this body, and how things are perceived on earth now, and getting deeper into the sutras and my understanding of what food is as a nutriment for the physical body, I recently decided to open myself up to just eating sort of any sort of way. I wouldn't even call myself a vegetarian or a vegan or anything like that anymore. And in doing this, I just wanted to share that I realized, to me, that has been a harm reduction approach. I'm someone personally who just takes a lot more, very specifically from what the sutras say. So, for example, like looking at the Buddha Sutta, I think that's how you say it, where about the son's flesh, how even the parents might eat the son's flesh, but why? And the reason and the intention behind it. I've realized that we may often think about animals and harm reduction to them, but I, at least in my previous time, was not thinking about perhaps the harm or offense caused to those living people who may have prepared meat dishes and with such love, and then I was consistently just refusing it. And I realized that it was, for me personally, like the Nisara Bhikkhu was saying, could happen was rising unskillful qualities, almost where I felt that there was a bit of a pedestal. I'm fruitarian, and I wouldn't eat that. And
Yeah.
really, what was that fueled by? This ego. And it was so unwholesome. Whereas now, where, to be quite honest, and I know this may be controversial for some people, but there have been times where I have consumed meat because, for example, in other countries in the monastery, when there's food offered, it's majority meat, which I was surprised to. But because I was opening my heart to that and just accepting what's being offered, I found that I became less concerned about attachment to particularities of this world and my beliefs, and instead just simply utilizing food to continue life for the purposes of reaching higher states, but like ending that sort of trajectory. So why I wanted to share this is because I feel like it's seen that these sorts of what you might call aesthetic practice like vegetarianism, veganism, whilst that may be beautiful and definitely encouraged, and those close to me still would not cook me meat or know that, that's not something I agree with. I think that it is should be emphasized even more so about what unskillful qualities may arise in that practice and what is more worth it. I think the idea of being vegetarian or vegan, just having these particular labels, whereas it's sort of setting yourself up to not be flexible with the way that life comes. And I think that you could be 90%, for example, vegan, and then just on an odd occasion, once or twice, have meat, but being open to that might actually cause less harm.
Yeah. I believe I addressed that in the beginning, talking about intention, right? Is this bringing up wholesome or unwholesome qualities? I think it's something we need to reflect on personally rather than defining a vegan or vegetarian practice as potentially being unwholesome in the sense of being ego-driven. Sometimes it's one of the arguments that, like, oh, if you have a vegetarian label, you think you're better than other people. Um, Quite often, most vegetarians I've met don't think that way. I think there are some vocal people that might be like online, or that like are out and protesting. And it's something, yeah, definitely reflect on for oneself, what's my motivation? What's my intention? What is my mind doing? How am I impacting the people around with my practice? And what kind of countermeasures can I take, right, to prevent that so that it remains a wholesome practice? For example, as a monastic, before I go places, I let people know ahead of time, Usually they ask now. Or for example, I might not go to a monastery that I know that they frequently offer meat, because it's not my practice and my approach, right? It's not that I have any negative feeling about them. They're welcome to practice as they wish in a community. But, I wouldn't put myself in a way that would inconvenience others. Particularly with like some of the other variations of vegetarian, like you mentioned fruitarian or raw vegan, for example. These are very difficult socially, you know. And again, I think the intent and the motive is different, right? It's often about my own health, right? Or some sort of concept of like, if I only eat this thing, my body will be pure and I will like transform into light, you know, and like sparkles will come out of everywhere, right? So we have this kind of attitude, right? You know, because we can also say, you know, cows, they don't eat meat. Are they more spiritual, right? They're not, right? They're not Buddhas. I mean, maybe there's a secret one somewhere, but generally cows they eat grass. But, you know, they're missing the intention part. They're not able, you know, to reflect on what kinds of qualities are coming up in their mind. So I think it's a very good point, you know, sharing that process that you had for yourself and, you know, what your motives and your intentions are and how you might change and maybe what you prioritize, right? Um, I think, you know, sometimes there's a difference too between lay and monastic practice in terms of vegetarianism because our social circumstances, our control are different. In Taiwan, as I mentioned, they did a really great job in terms of educating in general the benefits. They didn't say you have to become vegetarian. They don't demand anyone to be, but they just said this is very good, right? And this is a good thing to do at the temples. And then naturally the temples became vegetarian. And then they started making really amazing vegetarian food because they're like, we want to turn people on to being vegetarian. So we're going to just like go all out. Um, but in other countries, it's different. And I know I have an Indian friend, monastic teacher, and he was vegetarian as well, and experienced a similar thing in Thailand, you know. But then he was able to talk with the community, and there was a transformation there, you know, to see how it could be a practice they could incorporate, and that it wouldn't be difficult for everyone, you know, it wouldn't have that kind of negative social impact. So that's, I think, where skill in teaching and relating and communicating and being flexible at times and kind of understanding what our shared vision might be. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Venerable, and thank you, Simran,
Yeah.
as well for that. I
Yeah.
think it was quite interesting where you started talking, Venerable, about how there are monasteries that they would mainly offer meat.
Mm.
And you alluded to this as well at the start of the presentation when you talked about, you know, the different rules for the permissibility of meat.
Right.
Because I know one of the comments in the chat was around the rules suspected.
Yeah.
And where, you know, occasionally, and I'll just read verbatim that
Yeah.
Mukudin, often we will go to a restaurant with a monastic and there are vegetarian options and still there will be offering of meat dishes to the monastic.
Mm.
So I wonder, is this, would you say often because of maybe like cultural practices? Because I know in, you know,
Yeah.
often, you know, for people to be offered meat is, you know, it's often a nicer,
Yeah.
sort of more expensive or the
Yeah.
more, you know,
Definitely.
higher gift to be given to someone than
Right. Right. Right.
lentils.
Right. Yeah, and these fall in the categories of fine foods that are mentioned in
Mm,
the sutras, like delicious and tasty and fine foods. They're like high quality items, right? Because
mm,
again, we're talking, you know, that there wasn't refrigerators, right? So to be offered meat was like actually a huge deal, right? And so, you know, this suspected if you think a monastic is gonna, you know, oh, they're gonna come by, I should, you know, pick the freshest cow, you know, freshest meat, freshest whatever. You know, and then offer that. Um, if the monastic suspects that's what happened, right, it would not clear that third point, right? And so there's an implied refusal there. Sometimes people will say, oh, you know, monastics have to accept everything. But this is not universal. This differences in traditions. For example, if someone offers you poison in your bowl, do you have to accept and eat it? Right? If I
mm.
can see that there's glass in the food, you know what I mean? It's not, I don't, oh, but you know, you're being generous and I just have to assume best intentions, right? So there is some level of being able to respond to or decline politely, right? Not out of some sort of like, oh, how dare you? Or if you have an allergy, right? You have an allergy to shellfish and someone wants to offer a bunch of shrimp, you know, are you going to just accept and then eat and then have to go to the hospital? Of course not. Uh, so yeah, when you're talking about like nowadays, you know, again, you know, each community and temple will deal with it in a different way. Some would say that, you know, if you're going and you're buying meat and then taking that meat and then immediately offering it to the monastic, you bought it for them. You know, it falls under that. It was suspected, right? It's different perhaps if I order a dish, I order a meat dish, and then I go, oh, by the way, you should try this, right? Here's some, right? This is like a secondary intent behind it. I didn't go out and do this specifically for the monastic. And again, I'm sure people will agree and have different viewpoints, and that's totally fine. Even in the Tibetan tradition, a very meat-heavy culture because of the climate, there were vegetarian practitioners, that were advocating throughout Tibetan Buddhist history for various reasons. You were even, kind of critiquing this with certain ceremonies that will offer a lot of meat because it's considered a high-quality offering, and for protector practices in particular. And then there's kind of like, well, we're asking these protectors to protect sentient beings, but then we're killing sentient beings to give to them to protect us, right? So we do have to reconcile that somehow for ourselves. And again, I'm not advocating that there's some unilateral moral kind of thing. It's really going to depend on your own circumstances and your own conditions.
Great, thank you for that. One final question that I received is that the Buddha in his time was not a vegetarian and neither was the Sangha. Vegetarianism started in Eastern/Asian Buddhism post the time of the Buddha. I believe the question's asking about that shift as to when.
Shift, right. For Buddhism, yeah, it became more explicitly vegetarian. But I believe it's Mahakashyap, no, who is it? Bakula Arha is considered to have been vegetarian. There were Jains as well that were vegetarian. In the Vedic culture, there was vegetarian practice. It wasn't something that didn't exist. Devadatta suggested being vegetarian. So it must have been prevalent within the religious, social environment. And there is debate. It's not confirmed because we don't, the records we have of the Buddha come hundreds of years later. And there's this debate on whether, he died of a mushroom called pig's morsel, or it was actually a morsel of pig meat, depending on which historical records you want to look at and have faith in. Yeah, but there were vegetarian practitioners. We could assume so, that there must have been people that chose to be vegetarian because it was coming up as a topic between Devadatta and the Buddha himself, and people went that direction. It's probably unlikely that the Buddha said, oh, you can accept meat, therefore that means you don't need to be vegetarian or you shouldn't practice vegetarian practice. He didn't make a ban on it. He just said it's okay to accept meat if it's offered in this particular way, which, looking again at how often someone might kill an animal and there's no storage, probably people were vegetarian much of the time, unless they were coming across a festival or a special occasion where someone might have killed an animal. So yeah, that's my take on it. I don't think they were eating 3 meals of steak, or sorry, 1.5 meals of steak every day, well,
Great, thank you so much,
yeah,
Venerable.
yeah,
And
thank you.
I think that's basically almost time for us. Before I ask you to do a dedication of merit, I'll just quickly run through a few announcements for Metta Center. So thank you all for attending this evening. As you all know, this was one of our Monday evening chats. Venerable, do we have you again next week, or is it the
I believe
week?
on the 30th.
The
Yes.
30th, okay, in 2 weeks' time.
Talking
Fantastic.
about gender a little bit.
Great. That's
Yeah.
yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. I believe I'm also going to be emceeing that one. So that will
Okay,
be great. We also have yoga on tomorrow, again, which I believe is being held at the Parramatta campus, but you can find the details on the website for that. Wednesday, we have our usual meditation class, which is being held at Western Sydney University. Apologies, the yoga is in Bankstown. Thank you, Tina, for reminding me of that. And importantly as well, we have a tea ceremony this weekend, which all of the online registrations are now completely full. However, if you did still wish to attend this amazing event, please reach out to Tina, as there may still be some spots available. As always, if you wanted more details about Metta Center events, please reach out to join the WhatsApp groups and look at the website as well. On that note, Venerable, I will pass back to you to do a dedication of merit and to finish us up for this evening.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So again, thank you all for your time and your attention and your thoughtfulness. And we would like to dedicate the merits. So all of the good results, effects, causes, all the habits, we've been developing through thinking about, studying, contemplating, debating, analyzing the Dharma, right? Different teachings of the Buddha, different practices. We wish to dedicate all of these merits, both for our own relief from suffering, our own liberation and future enlightenment, as well as the liberation and enlightenment of all other sentient beings. And may we each become very skillful, very wise, and very compassionate in our behaviors and our relationships with one another until that time of full enlightenment. So, Amitabha, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Venerable.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Sorry, can I just also, while you're here, Venerable Myōgen, and I'd like
Yes.
to also introduce you to Venerable Pasana, who happens to be here as well, because
Oh, great,
I think
great.
that you have made like initial contact in the group, and Venerable Pasana is part of Rainbow as well. So we look
Okay,
forward
great,
to having you. I believe Venerable Myōgen might be coming to Australia in
I
November.
hope.
So.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Good to meet you, Venerable Pasana. Also, there's another Venerable here I'd like to say, Venerable Jurjue, Chikaku. Yeah, I like that there's able to have different monastics together and share different approaches. So thank you so much for coming.